Hello guys, and welcome to this new episode of the Unexplainable podcast. Today's episode is one that will be able to generate some debate. Many of the stories I've told recently feature people who claim to be able to see or communicate with spirits. Believe it or not, there are numerous people who claim to possess this gift, if we want to call it that. However, the case of Heidi Wyrick is different. It became very famous in the 90s, and even inspired a movie, The Haunting in Connecticut 2, Ghosts of Georgia, which was released in theaters in 2014. Heidi is a glaring example of a person who, far from considering herself privileged to possess this ability, would have much preferred to do without it. What we call a gift is not always welcome, so here is today's terrifying gift from Heidi Wyrick. It's an episode that will be able to generate some debate. Many of the stories I've been telling feature people who claim In February of 1989, Elizabeth and Andrew Wyrick, a young couple who had always lived in Georgia, decided to radically change their lives. Tired of the stressful rhythms of the big city, they decided to offer their 4-year-old daughter, Heidi, a quieter place to grow up. They began looking for a place in one of the nearby towns and found it in Dellersley. The house they bought was exactly what they had always dreamed of. Although it needed a reform, the price was not prohibitive at all, and its location was perfect. In a neighborhood without crime, next to the school that Heidi would attend and not far from Andrew's workplace. In short, everything was going swimmingly until the little one began to show strange behavior. One day, while Elizabeth was cleaning the kitchen, she glanced out the window into the garden where her daughter Heidi was. At first, she didn't notice anything strange. The little one seemed cheerful, running back and forth, barefoot on the lawn, laughing uproariously. Just moments before she looked away to resume her chores, she noticed that her behavior was somewhat strange. She often stopped, looked up, and spoke animatedly, just as if she was having a conversation with someone. When she gathered herself to ask for an explanation, Heidi simply said that she was talking to her friend, Gordy, a gentleman with white hair, dressed in a jacket and tie and dark patent leather shoes. The first thing that went through Elizabeth's mind was that her daughter had an imaginary friend. At her age, it was quite normal, especially considering they had just moved to the country and she hadn't made any friends there yet. It didn't seem so unusual that she had adopted the imaginary friend technique to combat loneliness. However, her description of her friend Gordy was so precise for a girl her age, it was worrisome that she might be talking about a real person. Perhaps someone who, in the absence of her parents, had approached her multiple times to gain her trust. To avoid unpleasant surprises, Heidi's mother reiterated to Heidi that she should never talk to strangers, and Heidi promised not to do so. But from that moment on, the situation became even more unsettling. First of all, it should be considered that Heidi, at her age, had no idea that Gordy was not a flesh and blood person. She saw him and spoke to him as she did with everyone else. That's why she was able to describe him so accurately. In the days following the incident, which happened in the garden, Elizabeth asked several neighbors about Mr. Gordy, but no one knew him or had ever heard of him. The conclusion was the one that had already been considered before. Heidi had created this character in her mind, and surely she would put it aside over time, as happens to all children. But she was greatly mistaken. One evening, while Elizabeth and Heidi were dining alone at home, someone knocked on the door. Heidi immediately got up from the table to answer it, but when Elizabeth didn't see her return after a few minutes, she became worried and rushed to check. She was about to reach the front door when she saw Heidi standing in the hallway, intent on returning to the kitchen. She asked her who had rung the doorbell, and her answer sent a chill down her spine. The little one described him as a man with a blood-stained shirt and a bandaged arm, who said his name was. Scared, she ran toward the entrance and flung the door open. But when she looked outside, she couldn't see anyone, not a single living soul nearby. Only a few seconds had passed since Heidi had opened the door. It was absolutely impossible that the man could have moved away so quickly as to lose his tracks. He thought again that Heidi had made it up, that it was yet another imaginary friend of his daughter. But how to explain the fact that they really had rung the doorbell and that Heidi provided such a precise description? Undecided on what to do, Elizabeth spoke about these strange episodes with her husband Andrew, who, far from worrying, proposed a solution. Convinced that all those imaginary friends were the result of the little girl's feeling of loneliness, he suggested adopting a dog that could keep her company. The next day they went to the dog shelter and brought home a wonderful puppy, which Heidi fell in love with instantly. But once they got home, the animal started behaving strangely, often barking with its gaze directed towards nothing. It would sit for hours in different parts of the house, tail between its legs. Terrified, it showed signs of unjustified nervousness, barely ate, and one day it ran away from home and never returned. What had driven Heidi's dog to behave in that way? What was it constantly afraid of? Contacted the kennel to ask if it had shown that behavior before. Elizabeth and Andrew were speechless to find out that it had always been a calm animal that had never caused any problems. A doubt as terrible as it was hard to believe began to emerge in their minds. And if those of their daughter were not just imaginary friends? Although they were quite skeptical, at that point it was not possible to rule out the fact that Heidi could see and talk to spirits. So Elizabeth had an idea to retrieve the old documents of the house to investigate its previous owners. And imagine the surprise combined with deep unease when she realized that one of the old tenants was a certain James S. Gordy. Disturbed by the discovery, she called her sister Joyce, who had recently moved to her same neighborhood, and asked to speak with her. Upon hearing Elizabeth's story, the woman suggested she ask for more information about Mr. Gordy to the old owner of the house where she had moved, Catherine Ledford, who had lived in that area for many years before selling her property. The next day, Catherine went to Elizabeth's house confirming the existence of James Gordy, and she also showed her some photographs of the neighborhood that had been taken many years before, where the man appeared standing in front of the entrance door of his villa. And as expected, he was an elderly man with white hair, jacket and tie, and dark patent leather shoes. And it was at that very moment that Heidi, who was sitting next to her mother, upon seeing the photograph, exclaimed, "It's him, Mom. It's really him, Mr. Gordy." A statement that was followed by a disturbing silence. But there's more. Among the photographs brought by Catherine, there was another one that had immediately caught the little girl's attention. At the sight of that additional shot, Heidi exclaimed, "Look, Mom, this is Con, the man who knocked on the door a few days ago." And indeed, it was one of Catherine's uncles named Con, who often visited her when she lived there. But the most shocking thing is that a few years before he lost his life to a tumor, the man had an accident while working in the factory and lost one of his hands. So the blood on the shirt, the bandaged arm, everything matched perfectly. There were no doubts anymore. Heidi wasn't talking to imaginary friends, but with spirits who, for one reason or another, were still tied to the house where she lived. Sure, unlike when we talk about evil presences or demons, the spirits that Heidi saw were mostly harmless. But it would always be like this. Determined to shed light on the matter and to remove any doubt, the Wyrick couple decided to ask an expert's opinion. And this is where a certain William G. Roll comes into play. Roll S. Investigation. According to Roll's opinion, Heidi had a gift, that of being able to perceive the residual energy impregnated in places and objects. The scholar did not go into the discussion of the existence of spiritual entities or not. He was more inclined to think that energy could somehow remain connected to certain environments, and that some people, like Heidi, were able to perceive it even after a long time. To be clear, what Heidi saw, in his opinion, were just memories of the past. However, this did not explain at all his ability to maintain conversations with entities. The situation changed when the couple's second daughter, Wyrick Jordan, was born. As I was saying, Heidi until that point had always made contact with good spiritual entities. Although her gift caused some unease in her parents, it didn't seem to pose any danger. But when Jordan arrived at the house, things changed drastically. During the night, Heidi would often wake up abruptly and start screaming at the top of her lungs. According to her, she often saw two presences in the house, different from those she used to encounter when she was a child. These were dark beings with distorted faces who kept approaching her or her little sister's crib. Deep down, she could sense that their intentions were not good, and for this reason, she developed an extreme fear of being alone and sleeping in her room. Elizabeth and Andrew were desperate. They noticed the terror in little Heidi's eyes, but they had no idea how to resolve the situation. Moreover, they began to seriously wonder if their little one's fear was a sign that something bad was really about to happen, and if they were in danger. One day, when the couple left Heidi and Jordan with a babysitter to go out for dinner, the unthinkable happened. Late in the evening, the young woman named Kelly began to hear a strange noise coming from the room where Jordan's crib was located. It seemed like the little one was fussing, so she went to check. When she got there, she was terrified to notice that one of the curtain cords was around the newborn's neck, knotted like a noose. Heidi had been with her the whole time, so it was absolutely not possible that it was her fault. She immediately called Elizabeth and Andrew, who, alarmed, returned home. That episode worried them a lot, so much so that they asked for William Roll's intervention again. This time, the theory of residual energy did not seem sufficient to explain the huge amount of paranormal phenomena they had witnessed. Determined to shed light on the Roll case, he asked for the intervention of a medium. Arriving at the mansion, Amy Allen, this was the name of the psychic. She immediately got to work. She entered each room of the house and, after completing her investigation, proceeded to report her findings. According to her, the villa was inhabited by 4 entities. An older man who had the task of protecting it, surely Mr. Gordy, a shy and frightened little girl, and 2 spirits whose faces appeared dark and whose features were unidentifiable. When Elizabeth asked the medium if these 2 presences were demons, the woman told her she absolutely did not believe in their existence. According to her, the reason their faces appeared distorted was because they had not been good people during their lives. They were dark presences because their souls were not pure, but this did not mean they were demons. Not convinced by the answer, Elizabeth decided to seek a second opinion from another medium. After visiting the house, the woman confirmed what Amy Allen had said, but with a difference. In her opinion, the dark presences inhabiting the dwelling could very well have a malevolent nature. It was not to be ruled out that these were indeed demonic entities, arrived in the house through some kind of portal present in their dwelling. But it was another observation made by the medium that generated pure terror in all the family members. According to her, Heidi had a gift from birth, the ability to see and communicate with spirits, even against her will. This characteristic would accompany her for the rest of her life, and one which she would have to learn to live with. And although it is spoken of as a gift, being endowed with this special ability would inevitably put her in difficult situations, especially considering the general skepticism of society towards the paranormal. The consequences of this presented themselves shortly after. Heidi's case had become public knowledge in Georgia, but the people's reaction was extremely cruel. Some thought that the Wyrick family had made it up to get into the spotlight and gain popularity. Others, however, thought they were just gullible or even that they had mental problems. The one who suffered the worst consequences was Heidi herself. She was isolated at school and was constantly bullied. Being still very young, the girl narrated her experiences with extreme naturalness. For her, it was completely normal to be able to communicate with spirits, but it certainly wasn't for her classmates or their parents. Elizabeth and her husband began to seriously consider the possibility of moving elsewhere. But the turning point, the one that led to the final decision, occurred, a night like any other. They had just gone to sleep when Heidi's parents heard her screaming at the top of her lungs in her bedroom. Worried, they rushed there to check, and when they arrived in the room, they were petrified in finding the little girl on the floor, struggling against what they described as a dark shadow trying to drag her under the bed. This time they could see it too. They grabbed her by the arms and noticed how her body was being pulled in the opposite direction. It was absolutely impossible that Heidi was pretending. There was really someone or something physically attacking her. The whole thing only lasted a couple of minutes, but once calm was restored, Elizabeth knew exactly what to do. It was time to leave that dwelling, or, to put it better, to get as far away from the city as possible so that Heidi could return to living a peaceful life. The dark presences that inhabited the villa, combined with her gift, were not a good combination at all. Within a few days, the Wyrick couple found an apartment in Columbus and the situation improved. However, this does not mean that Heidi had freed herself from her gift, exactly as had been predicted by the medium. Over the years, her ability to make contact with the souls of the deceased not only did not disappear, but increased, making her life very complicated. In an interview given in adulthood, Heidi Wyrick stated that her ability was now a secret that she had to guard jealously to protect herself and her family. She had not at all forgotten the torment suffered because of the skepticism of her neighbors, classmates, and even teachers. The best solution was to keep quiet, and this is the attitude she still adopts today. At this point, however, one has to ask, is Heidi's gift real? Or could the explanation be something else? As I always do at this point, all that's left is to hand it over to the skeptics. As hard as it may be to believe, Heidi's story is like that of many other people who identify themselves as sensitives or mediums. In these years dedicated to the unexplainable, I myself have met several people who claim to possess this extraordinary ability. So expressing a completely objective judgment on the matter is somewhat difficult for me. Those who have known me for a long time know that I tend to be skeptical when it comes to the paranormal. However, this does not change the fact that certain situations or events that I have witnessed firsthand are simply unexplainable. There are a great number of rational explanations that pure skeptics could propose to explain the experiences of people like Heidi. Visual or auditory hallucinations, mental problems, or simply an uncontrollable desire to attract attention. Anyone who even remotely rejects the idea of the existence of the supernatural will certainly have no problem proposing a logical point of view devoid of supernatural elements. However, the final word can only be yours. What do you think about the story of Heidi or others like her? Is this gift real, or does it need to be explained in another way? And finally, do you think you also possess a similar ability? And have you been part of a case that could be featured in one of the upcoming episodes? Send me your story to the email address, theunexplainable8@gmail.com. A hug to everyone, guys, and see you next time. Unexplainable Podcast is a series conceived, written, and hosted by Luca Perella, sound designed by Matteo D'Alessandro. Listen to it on YouTube or on all music and podcast platforms.